It's a strange feature of liberal climate thinking that there is a kind of enthusiasm for the authoritarianism of Xi Jinping because he faces fewer obstacles than an American president does in making action.
What a Faustian bargain. Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer, and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast, an audio version of what you can find on public television, where I analyze global topics, sit down with big guests, and make use of small puppets. This week I sit down with New York Magazine writer David Wallace-Wells, whose new book explores how climate change will alter the way humans live on Earth. Or not. Spoiler alert, not. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
David Wallace-Wells, author of The Uninhabitable Earth. Good to be with you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm not sure I should say good to be with you. I mean, you say you're an optimist, but this book is a challenging read, right? A lot more urgency and a lot more disturbance about where we are heading than certainly anything mainstream I've seen in the past couple of years. Where are you on, why are you an optimist?
To me, it's a matter of perspective. So if you look at the world today, you look at the window outside, the way that life is going on, and you define that as your baseline, I think there's no way to be scientifically responsible and optimistic because the world is certainly going to get hotter. And as it gets hotter, it's going to get more dangerous. It's going to get less healthy. There are going to be damages and suffering beyond what anyone today would consider conscionable. But if you define your baseline as 4 degrees of warming, which is where we're scheduled to get by the end of the century if we don't change course, then I think there's quite a lot that can be done to avert a lot of those outcomes, a lot of those impacts, and I think we will do that. So just to give you a sense of where we'd end up if we don't change course, at 4 degrees, it's estimated that we could have $600 trillion in global climate damages. That's twice as much wealth as exists in the world today. We would have hundreds of millions of climate refugees. There would be parts of the world that could be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. We could have twice as much war because there's a relationship between temperature and conflict. And all across the board, every aspect of life would be impacted almost in all cases negatively. I don't think we'll get all the way there, but I also think that something like 2 degrees, which the UN calls the threshold of catastrophe, and many island nations of the world call genocide.
It's basically baked in at this point.
I think it's about our best case scenario, yeah.
2 degrees you think is possible?
I think it's there's a matter of technically possible. There's also a matter of what's politically feasible. Right. I think if there was a global dictator who could command the world's economies and turn them on a dime, but given the politics that we do have and the economies that we do have, I think that 2 degrees is just about our best case scenario right now.
Now, when we talk about why we're here right now, how we've gotten to this point where the damage that's going to be done to the planet in the most optimistic scenario is considerably worse than what any normal citizen would think is okay. You also point out very clearly that the reason we're here is mostly not what individual human beings are doing. It's not the behavior that you or I or other wealthy people in the world. It's more about industry. It's more about infrastructure. Talk about that.
Well, yeah, I think we have a few misconceptions about how we got here. One is that this is a really long story that started in the Industrial Revolution. This is actually a kind of a more important misapprehension for me. Half of all of the emissions that we've put into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels have come in the last 30 years. That's since Al Gore published his first book on warming. It's since the UN established its IPCC. And that means that collectively we've done more damage to the climate knowingly than we ever managed in ignorance. It also means that it is you and I, in a collective sense, the world as it has existed over the last 30 years that has brought us from a stable climate to the brink of catastrophe. But it's absolutely true that the contributions of individuals are totally trivial. Some individuals make an outsized impact. Air travel is an especially problematic feature. One round-trip ticket in the US is the equivalent of about 8 months of driving.
And yet, that's not what is driving. I mean, I say this because so many people that talk about climate change,
they want people to focus on
if individuals, if we could just reduce our carbon footprint, that's going to be what makes the difference. And that's clearly from your book not what's going to make the difference.
The crisis is just way too big to solve with individual choice and action. It's all-encompassing, overwhelming.
But it's mostly industry, right?
Well, I would say just generally policy, which governs industry, agriculture, it governs transportation, it governs diet. There's basically no aspect of modern life that is untouched by climate change. And because the scale is so big, I think it can really only be addressed through policy and politics. But industry is, I think, about 30 or 40% of the global carbon footprint. Energy is another 30%. Agriculture is also about 30, 40%. It's not one sector for me. It's that the message that we've been given that we can make a difference by eating less meat or traveling less as individuals, to me, that's a total red herring, because the contribution of any individual, even any mass of individuals, is trivial compared to what policy can achieve. So for instance, we've heard a lot recently about beef, the carbon problem with beef. And it's true. Cattle produce a lot of methane through burps, mostly burps, some farts, but they produce a lot of methane. Methane's a really powerful greenhouse gas. And if I were a better environmentalist, I would probably eat a couple less hamburgers every year. But there are also small-scale studies that show that you could reduce the methane output of cows by as much as 95 or 99% by just feeding them a little bit of seaweed. So if there was a policy put into place that made all cattle farmers fold in, say, 5% of their beef diet would be seaweed, we could eliminate the carbon footprint of beef entirely. And that is to me, a much straighter, more profound, more dramatic impact than trying to rally the world's liberals around a vegan diet, especially because trying to rally a lot of people around veganism is going to turn a lot of people off. And because the story is so big, because the threat is so big, I think we need as many people as possible on board, as many people as possible focused on climate change. And if we tell them they need to meet an extremely demanding scenario to even count as climate responsible, I think a lot of people are going to turn away from that.
Well, again, it has less to do with whether you turn people off as just the science, right? I mean, if no matter what individuals do, that's not moving the needle.
I would say even more than science, it's math. Another big part of the story that I think many Americans misunderstand is that the U.S. is only 15% of global emissions. And on a per capita basis, we play a bigger role. And historically, we played a bigger role.
But today,
China is already about twice as big as the U.S. And that doesn't even count all of the infrastructure they're building in Africa and Asia as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. If concrete were a country, it would be the world's third biggest emitter. And China is today pouring as much concrete every 3 years as the U.S. poured in the entire 20th century. So I think to a profound extent, the future climate of the planet will be determined principally by China,
India,
secondarily by India, and a bit by sub-Saharan Africa and how those countries develop.
I mean, here you're talking about nearly 1.5 billion people, India and China, 1 billion people, Africa. I mean, massively more than the United States and Europe put together. And they're developing. They're going to want to develop. How do you, as someone who has now spent all this time getting inside the rolling catastrophe that is and will be climate change, how do you balance that against 4 billion plus people that aspire to have an improved lifestyle, and indeed billions of people that have improved their lifestyles because concrete is a country, because their governments have been able to give them the kind of development and growth that we have achieved in the West?
Yeah, I think, the story over the last 25, 30 years has been really striking, that there have been these incredible gains in well-being, material well-being, many fewer people in poverty, much less infant mortality, much higher educational attainments in the developing world. And that is largely a story, that's a great story, it's an exciting story, but it's largely a story of industrialization. And so it does have this huge carbon cost. Going forward, I think the terms of that trade-off will be a bit different. Already in much of the world, green energy is cheaper than dirty energy. I think in short order, it will be the case everywhere in the world. And that means someone who's living in global poverty in India might have a responsible path of development that is just as enriching and provides just as much prosperity and just as short a trip to global middle classness as 10 years ago, you would have had to take a fossil fuel-driven path to.
And the overwhelming majority of electricity today in China is coming from coal.
Yeah.
And they've invested in India, right? They've invested in that infrastructure. I mean, the cost that would be borne on a much less wealthy government and less wealthy people to make that change is hard to conceive of in today's environment.
Yeah,
right?
although they've also, both of those countries have made massive investments in renewables as
Yes,
well.
but as you say in your book, it hasn't actually changed the percentage of the renewables that are being used in those countries. It's just basically keeping up with a much larger demand base.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, my hope is that going forward, that the thinking in those countries changes as dramatically as we're seeing it change in the UK, in the EU, and in the US over the last few years. And that may be a little naive of me, but my hope is that especially Xi Jinping will honor the sort of rhetorical commitments that he's made over the last few years. I think he's seen an opportunity in the era of Donald Trump to play the role of moral leader on climate, and has made significant investments in green energy. But there's still these.
But let me push you on this, right? Because again, you're an important voice in this topic. And I mean, you've said that most of the carbon emissions in the world have come in the last 30 years since Al Gore wrote his sort of first defined book on this is going to be a big global problem. The Chinese are very well aware, right, of exactly the nature of the problem. The science is not open to question on that. And yet the policies that we see from China today have been a massive increase in real carbon emissions because their demands, especially the demands of a country that is vastly less wealthy than the United States, is first, I need political stability, and therefore I need to ensure that my people have growth. Economic growth. So, I mean, as much as I absolutely agree with you that we are seeing a big change in popular awareness about the severity and the immediacy of the problem, it's hard to imagine on the basis of everything that you and I have seen and experienced from Chinese and Indian governance. And again, you say policy is the issue. We need to change policy. They're speaking pretty loudly with their policies, are they not?
Well, I would say that certainly the Chinese picture on climate is more encouraging than it was in 2015 and 2012. So they have made progress there. There's still a huge, long ways to go, but I'm hopeful on that front, in part because the economic conventional wisdom of this sort of basic dilemma has really changed over the last couple of years. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, almost every economist you spoke to would say that while the humanitarian cost of climate change might be significant, it didn't really add up in dollars and cents to all that much, and that it would be costly to act on climate, first in the sense of making massive upfront investments, and secondly, I think more importantly, in the sense of foregoing some economic growth. So for instance, we'd have to burn less coal, we'd have to close down coal plants before they were of retirable age. That conventional wisdom has actually really changed over the last couple of years. And now I think it's fair to say that most economists believe that faster action on climate would have payoffs even in the relatively short term.
Who are, in your view, if we actually take real action quickly, who gets hurt?
I think that there are obviously business sectors, the energy, existing energy companies that may suffer. There are maybe some short-term costs in terms of, the infrastructure projects that are expensive and impose a burden on public budgets. But I have a perspective that this is all, in a relatively short order, will pay off in ways that the public will really appreciate.
But do you see those interests? I mean, when you talk about, for example, the anti-smoking lobby, you had strong interest spending a lot of money doing everything possible to prevent that agenda from being moved publicly. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, we have. I mean, the fossil fuel business has been, I think, absolutely atrocious in this way, especially with their sort of, along the cigarette model, with their disinformation and denial. A lot of really great early climate science from the 60s and 70s was actually funded by these companies, but then suppressed. And that's been really bad. But when I look globally, denial is not really an issue elsewhere in the world like it is in the US. There's a little bit of in the UK, but basically nowhere else. And nowhere else in the world are people behaving any better when it comes to carbon as in the US. So that makes me think that these forces may be overrated as determinants of our complacency, and that in general, the complacency of our voters may be the bigger problem, that we don't want to prioritize action for a variety of reasons having to do with misunderstanding or underestimating the threat, perhaps overestimating the cost that it would impose on our lives, and a number of others, including just the psychological biases and reflexes we have that make us not want to consider really scary outcomes so we don't take them seriously. I think those are bigger factors than, say, the oil business and the way that it has conquered the Republican Party in the U.S. As atrocious as I find the oil business and their behavior on this, and as regrettable as I find their purchase on the Republican Party to be, I still don't think those are ultimately determinative because, again, when you look around the world, those are not forces present in other countries' politics, and yet nobody's doing better than the U.S. is. I think there's something kind of deeper than the force of entrenched interests, and I think even deeper than the force of capitalism.
So as we look over not the next 50 years, but over the next 5 years, what's the thing that is feasible that if it happens, you say to yourself, you know what? I think my more optimistic trajectory, we might just meet it.
Well, I think the most important and easiest thing that can be done is to end subsidies for fossil fuels. There are estimates for how much of that is being going on globally that run as high as $5 trillion a year. And just to give you a sense of how much that is, there is technology now that you can use to suck carbon out of the atmosphere at a cost of $100 a ton. It has not been tested at scale. There are many, many complications about implementing it. But you could neutralize the entire carbon footprint of the global economy, which means we would continue acting exactly as we have been without adding any more carbon to the atmosphere at a cost of $3 trillion a year. So by some estimate, we're subsidizing fossil fuels more than would be needed to completely neutralize the entire carbon footprint of the economy.
And when you say subsidizing fossil fuels, you mean, for example, what?
Well, I mean, there are many, all around the world, many different forms. I mean, it's complicated to give.
I mean, avoiding, for example, treating them as public goods in terms of the damage they do to climate. I mean, carbon taxes, these sorts of things.
Yeah. But I think you can also spend that money on, research and development. There's, I think, a lot of reasonable thinking that, in fact, this is the most effective path that American policy could take because anything that is developed in the U.S. can be used elsewhere around the world. This is one of the reasons, that solar and wind power have gotten so much cheaper around the world is because of investments that were made in the stimulus package under Obama that really kickstarted a lot of development in that area. And I think there's much more R&D to do to continue making those technologies cheaper, but also to start developing what are called negative emissions technology, which are some of these approaches that can take carbon out of the atmosphere.
Yeah. David Wallace-Wells, The Uninhabitable Earth, his next book, We're All Gonna Die. Very good to be with you.
Thanks so much.
That's our show this week. We'll be right back here next week, same place, same time, unless you're watching on social media, in which case it's wherever you happen to be. Don't miss it. In the meantime, check us out at GZEROmedia.com.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.